Flosstube. This is an episode of Stories Behind the Needlework. Have you ever wondered about where our term shoddy comes from? Or have you heard about merchant cargo submarines for textiles? Or did you know that because England controlled the wool trade with an iron fist, German soldiers had to use gear woven with paper yarns? Well, these are all fascinating topics in the new book, Fleeced, Unraveling the History of Wool and War by Trish Fitzsimons and Madelyn. I've really loved this book because my entire engineering career has revolved around silk and wool and the synthetic fibers developed to replace them as strategic materials, a topic we will discuss with Madelyn and Trish, who are joining me today. Madelyn and Trish, it is really wonderful to have you on this Flosstube episode, and I thought I'd have you briefly introduce yourselves. So maybe Madelyn first.
Yes. Well, I've started out as a theater costumer, a history major turned theater costumer, turned museum curator in costume and textiles. And I have done several big projects, including Homefront and Battlefield, Quilts and Context in the Civil War with Lynn Bassett for the American Textile History Museum, much late and lamented. And that is how I met Trish.
And were you recently at the Smithsonian? Is that correct?
I was at American History from 2015 through 2020.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
And
curator of textiles, and which was wonderful.
And Trish, I understand that you are a film documentarian.
I am. I too was what you would call a history major, but I've got an eclectic head, Tricia, and rather than being a historian in one field, I became a documentary filmmaker and have made films about things as varied as the history of women's education to whether alternatives to violence in prison can work, to the story of women and land, yada, yada. I have written books. I have curated exhibitions. I knew nothing much about textiles until I met Madelyn when I saw her wonderful Homefront and Battlefield exhibition in New York. But my secret weapon is or was that my grandfather was a wool buyer, buying Australian wool for America mainly. He was part of 6 generations of wool buyers. And it just so happened that literally in the 24 hours before I saw Madelyn's exhibition, I had been reading a transcript of his letters to my grandparents as he learned the wool trade in first Britain and then America in the beginning of the 20th century. And it alerted me to the politics of wool. And seeing Madelyn's exhibition, I thought, aha, I've got to find this woman.
Fantastic. So how did the theme of war and wool come about with the two of you?
Trish came to Rhode Island. I had broken my foot and couldn't drive and meet her in Lowell. And she burst into my kitchen with lunch and said, "Where are your knives?" And I thought, well, she doesn't look like a serial killer. So she brought lunch and we sat down for what was supposed to be an hour or 90 minutes. And 4 hours later, we had nutted out this sort of idea about the strategic importance of wool in wartime. And it's something that both of us, on the Civil War project, I'd wonder, why isn't anybody really talking more about the textiles other than cotton? There's a lot more about wool than meets the eye. And at the same time, I think Trish had sort of, in looking at these letters, she had come up with some other questions and things that she wanted to answer. So over to her.
There was one, along with these letters that are written between 1903 and 1907, there was about 3 critical documents. One of them, Jeremiah Williams, was a huge wool concern in Summer Street in Boston. My grandfather was buying wool, had been buying wool for them for about 8 or 9 years. And in the First World War, instead of being an employee, he's negotiating his percentage. And he says to the guy from Jeremiah Williams, at a time such as this, any percentage that I ask for will seem too much, i.e., trying to think of a polite way of saying it, there's a lot of money to be made from buying and selling wool in wartime. So it was like, And then I saw Madelyn's exhibition that was full in different ways of the politics of textiles in wartime. And I just thought, I've got to find this woman. And I did.
So let's go back to the theme that wool has properties that would be desirable in wartime. I don't think everybody is up on why is wool something that's so useful in war.
Okay. One of the things but first of all, for centuries, there was no other option but wool. There were before synthetics, and everybody needs to remember that synthetics are pretty recent.
Yes.
Wool was readily available for most people wore it in some way or another. Various qualities and weights and weaves of cloth and knitting, but wool was available. But in terms of the military, wool is very sturdy. It lasts. It takes dye very easily. Mm-hmm. So if you need to distinguish a red-coated soldier from a blue-coated soldier, it's a pretty good fiber to use. It inherently will keep you warm even when it's wet.
That, I think, is the most important feature, really.
And currently, what is the most important feature, but which was important in the past as well, is that it will not melt on you.
Absolutely. Yes.
It is flame, not retardant, but it is flame resistant.
Right.
So those things together, plus for quartermasters, the fact that it lasts and can be remade and reworked and finally, turned into, fertilizer is really important. But I think the two most important things historically are the fact that it lasts, that it keeps you warm when it's wet, and that nowadays that it's the flame resistance.
Well, this really speaks to that famous phrase that Napoleon said, which was that soldiers go to war on their stomach, meaning the supply lines. But in reality, from my own experience, and I know from everything you've researched, that it's about the being on your feet in marching from place to place. And as soon as your feet get a little bit wet, if the moisture can't be wicked away from it by the wool, then you get blisters, and now you can't walk. And so people might be amazed to know that an enormous amount of technology goes towards trying to make sure that boots and socks are good. Yeah, Trish.
That's all true. It's also true that, Earth gets cold at night, even in the desert. My father was in the Second World War, and Australian issue military was 4 blankets. He always told us he'd put 3 of them underneath and just 1 over the top. And that those 3 blankets, allowed him to sleep well in El Alamein and other parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you guys have done a film together, and you, Trish, you sent it to me. Is that publicly available?
Yes, we have cleared all copyright on that. Yes, Australian Wool Innovation, which is the body that all Australian wool growers can contribute a percentage of their earnings to, sponsored that production, which was called Fabric of War, Why Wool. And yes, the link that I sent you is indeed publicly available. And it's been screened. I screened it in the Smithsonian. I think Madelyn may have as well. It got screened in Bristol, Rhode Island recently. It's been screened we've screened it at the Textile Society of America in Vancouver. So yes, it's publicly available, and if you wanted to share it with your audience, Tricia, I would be thrilled, as would Australian Wool Innovation, who paid for it.
Many really great graphics, and I think it also, as you pointed out to me, Trish, it talks a little bit about, and maybe you both could speak to it, about how industrialization of wool affected war, and then war affected wool. So it's like this chicken and the egg, and which one came first. So go ahead, Trish.
It is. Madelyn and I like to play with the hypothetical that if wool and the production of woolen textile had not been industrialized in the 19th century, perhaps the mass wars of the 20th century, especially the horrific conflict of the First World War, might never have happened, at least in the way they did, because the soldiers would have died. But what happened is that cotton gets industrialized first, and as the production of woolen textile occurs in the mid-19th century, they take that technology for cotton and adapt it to wool, but they need longer fibers. So there's an enormous amount of sheep husbandry. I mean, sheep husbandry goes back probably the 10,000 years that we humans have depended upon wool. But in the 19th century, in many parts of the world, but perhaps Australia in particular, there's enormous effort goes in to creating sheep that have long, fine wool that the factories will be able to deal with, that also creates animals that can cope with the Australian environment in particular. This is the driest continent on Earth, and for about the last 150, 170 years, I think, this has been the nation that has produced more wool for the global wool supply than any other. So creating animals that could withstand this continent, not the absolute arid interior, but a long way in, and that would create fine wool with a long staple that then the factories could work with. All of that is vital. But the other side of it is that the number of soldiers fighting these wars climbs exponentially. I don't have the numbers right in my head, but it literally, I think the civil wars maybe 500,600,000 people, 500,600,000.
It's more than that. It's nearly 1 million for the South, and it's more than that, several million, 4 million maybe for the North, but not all of them fought.
Mm-hmm.
So I defer to my learned American colleague. But yes, the number that then fight the First World War rises hugely because it's a global conflagration, and it then rises again for the Second World War. And with all those soldiers needing, I think the figure is 20 per soldier per year in the First World War, rising to 26 per soldier per year in the Second World War, you need so much wool. And that kind of contorts the global wool trade and, to a degree, warfare.
So let's review back to that, the numbers you just gave us, because I think that is something which is really unbelievable. You said 20. That's 20 sheep needed per year. So the fleece of 20 sheep were needed per year in order to outfit the kit, which is what you call it, the military kit, of one soldier in World War I, and 26 sheep were needed per year. So we're talking about millions and millions and millions of sheep. And maybe, Madelyn, you could talk about the amount of land that requires?
Well, the problem is that there aren't that many sheep.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
So, that is basically sort of the central point of the book, actually, is
Right.
that we started out thinking it's all about wool. And by the time we got into, I mean, we looked at the Napoleonic Wars, and, we looked at things like, well, Napoleon didn't really invade Russia in the winter. He invaded in June, but he retreated in the winter. And by then lost a good portion of his army to begin with at that point. But still, it was the supply chains. And the lines were so stretched, and retreating across a huge territory that is muddy and snowy, and you're bogged down. People can't get to you. The horses get stuck. The people get stuck. The wagons get stuck.
Right.
In the Korean War, and I'm going to digress for a minute here, in the Crimean War in 1853 to 56, that is really interesting because they start by offloading supplies at the port in the Crimea, and the weather's so bad they can't get the supplies to where they're investing Sevastopol or whatever. The British come in 1854 and they build a railway. And all of a sudden that turns the whole war around.
Yep.
By the Civil War, the railways are again helping those supply lines and bringing people and bringing arms and bringing more goods, more of the kinds of supplies they need, food.
Right.
And then, so by the time you get to World War I, they're heavily involved. All of that new technology of the railways is just vital to keep the supply chains going. And the other thing that begins to happen in Crimea, although we have a story about why that doesn't quite work, is steamship lines. And so when you've got these vast oceans between you in London or Yorkshire and Australia to get the wool to you, you need something faster than a clipper ship. Well, I could say that we have two stories that talk about the importance of wool in war, one of which is true, which is Thomas Blackett Stevens in Australia, who corners the market during the Crimean War in Queensland wool. And he and his partner start shipping it all out to London, right? They're just shoving it onto ships and shipping it out. And then they discover the war's been over for 3 months.
Oops.
And so they lose their shirts. And then Mark Twain has a story about oh gosh, Trish, what's his name?
Following the Equator is the name of the story, and Cecil Rhodes is who it's about.
Cecil Rhodes, yeah.
So the story is that Cecil Rhodes is on a beach in Australia, and he's down and out, and he's got nothing, and he helps a fisherman land and gut a shark, and he finds this piece of newspaper in the shark's stomach, and it says, the Franco-Prussian War has broken out. And he runs right over to some banker and says, I need all the money you can give me because Britain has declared war, or France and Prussia have declared war, and wool is going up on the London Exchange.
But that story is not true?
No, Twain's point was that the shark was faster than the ship, which is also an important point. But what we took from it was wool is important.
Yeah, very important. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of themes in there. Just a second here. The supply chain, of course, is hugely important. And so transportation and the ability to transport things as fast as war is being waged is an important accelerator of the size of the armies. And then, of course, you need lots of sheep in order to clothe them, which then gets you into this whole thing about how England has a strategic advantage because of empire. And maybe Trish can take your point and then go segue there.
Yes, I was just going to say, indeed, that supply chains are absolutely critical to wool. And, it's not a matter of just getting that wool to London. It's then got to be washed, processed, turned into yarn, turned into fabric. It's a complicated process producing wool. But yes, Britain, that had for about 600 years been an absolutely critical country. In fact, from the 11th century, Britain grows a lot of the sheep for Flanders and other manufacturing centres in Europe. Then it comes itself to be a manufacturing nation of wool. But by the 19th century, there's just not enough land and not enough sheep possible in Britain. So Britain's empire becomes absolutely critical to what will be its dominance of global sheep. Australia started as a colony in 1788 as a convict colony. The question of what are we going to do when the convicts are no more, exercised the minds, and sheep and wool became a critical answer to that question, as it did in New Zealand as well, and later, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but importantly, South Africa. So by the time the First World War breaks out, Britain controls about a third of the world's apparel wools, but of course it's all a long, long way from where the factories are, because Britain's made damn certain that its colonies and dominions are not going to be their manufacturing competitors. So war really complicates this story.
Yes, and so that brings up the fact that when you have natural resources really play into your ability to, or the control of natural resources, into your ability to wage war and protect yourselves as a country. So why don't we take a second or two and talk about some of the unique and fun, kind of interesting stories regarding countries and what natural resources they have and what they do because they don't have natural resources, such as Germany didn't have as many sheep, and so they had to find all kinds of ways in order to get wool or wool substitutes. And I know, is this where Shoddy comes in possibly?
Well, Shoddy has a longer history than that. Shoddy is developed in Dewsbury and Batley in Yorkshire in about the first decade of the 19th century. And it's basically reworked wool, recycled wool. And it's a way to use up the rags and also use up things like offcuts from tailors making uniforms and clothing and suits and whatnot. And they come up, there are machines that are called grinders, pickers, grinders, and they take the wool essentially back down to fiber, the woven. There's also a certain amount of dust that comes out of it at the end. And that's what they called flock, which is flock wallpaper and stuff like that. So but where Shoddy comes in and gets a really bad rap is during the American Civil War. And because all of a sudden your army goes from, I don't know, under 70,000 men or something. I mean, some ridiculously low number. I can't remember what it is now. To 500,000, like that. And they need to clothe them. And the textile manufacturers are all telling the uniform manufacturers, oh, yes, we can get you the textiles. We can get you the fabrics you need. No, they can't. There isn't that much wool in the country. And so they start using shoddy in more shoddy to the mix because they never used it alone. You had to mix it with new. So they mixed it a little more than they should have, and all heck broke loose in the government and the newspapers. And so there's an awful lot of that is when the term shoddy, which was really just a textile term for recycled wool for decades, becomes a synonym for poor quality and sort of deliberately inferior. So, but they can't, because, as we said, there are not enough sheep in the world to get those 20 sheep that they need for each soldier. They have to use shoddy in certain things. And so the military does use it. They try to put it only in things like overcoats and blankets, and sometimes in shirts, but mostly things that are not immediately touching the body.
Right, where you need to keep dry and warm.
Yeah, but also because there's this aura of taking things off of dead soldiers and washing them and stripping them and turning the refuse into new products that sits in the minds of the public. And they don't want to go there, right? They don't want you thinking about that, because in fact they did do that. But they don't want you to. So at least they did in World War I. So what happens in Germany, which is blockaded by the British during the First World War, they can't import anything. And wool is named contraband very early on in the war. And even though the Americans and the Italians, before the Italians get into the war, the Swiss and the Swedes are all trying to they're all neutral. They're allowed to trade, right? They're all trying to funnel some wool because it's valuable and they make money on it, to get around the blockade. By 1916, mid to late 1916, the Germans are very starved of almost any textile fiber. And so they're doing things like, they've always made nettle cloth, and they're looking at nettles as another way to sort of imitate cotton.
What are nettles, for those who don't know?
Nettles, it's like a grass. It's stinging nettles, so you have to be careful when you harvest them. But it's a plant that it's a bast fiber, kind of like linen, or hemp or something like that. They also are investigating things like milkweed fiber and cattail fiber, which is called typha. They investigate. But just before the war, there was a kind of it's a seaweed that was in Australia and New Guinea. That's actually a sea plant that when it dies, it kind of compacts down, kind of like peat. And so when it breaks down, it becomes stringy like linen, but in a different way. And then you can spin that. But of course, that's in Australia and New Guinea, and they can't get much of that either. They've got a little bit of a stock before the war. And then the big thing is really the paper yarn. And in 1907, a U.S. consul agent in Germany sends this whole slew of samples of German paper yarns and matting made from these paper yarns and all these different weights back to the States, saying, hey, look, the Germans are doing a lot with this. Maybe we should look into it. And by 1916, the Germans are not only making canvas, sort of a canvas-like cover for wagons, or they're making big hammocks out of big nets of paper yarns, thick paper yarns, the size of a finger. But they're making things like cartridge bag holders for ammunition, and they're making feed bags for horses. And we suspect because of some paper, because of some photographs in New Zealand at the Auckland War Memorial Museum. We suspect they might even have been making underwear for the soldiers out of these paper yarns. And the Newark Museum has 2 suits, civilian suits, that were bought after the war because they cost $5 as opposed to $50 or $75 for a wool suit at that point. The paper stuff is a really important part of, it doesn't work all that well, but it's what they had because it comes from cellulose.
Right.
The cellulose then becomes used in a different way in the interwar period as they transition to semi-synthetic and synthetic
Well,
research.
I think this is what you're saying. This is really that what I was talking about at the beginning, how this strategic need for just fiber of any sort has everybody, because they don't have enough sheep, searching for a replacement, that is grown, meaning cellulose fibers, etc. We're going to get to rayon from that. And then at some point, that type of source is exhausted, maybe because the properties aren't as good as the natural animal-based fibers, and people start looking for synthetics. Chemistry, better living through chemistry starts. And that's where we get all of this work to try to make. And I know we're going to try to push that off into a little bit of the end to talk about, but it's this continual cycle of the strategic need drives innovation, because if you don't have those natural resources, you have to find something. Otherwise, you lose the war. Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely.
I think that's absolutely right, Tricia. And the only thing I'd add about paper is the best of the substitutes that's tried by Germany and other nations in World War One. But you can imagine that paper suit or paper undies washed a couple of times. It's okay, but there's got to be something better we can do with this cellulose. And that becomes the story of the interwar.
Yes. Well, I don't want to use up all the wonderful stories that are in the book, because there's a lot of things like code books and transatlantic telegrams and things. But there's one that I really think is interesting and I want to talk about, which is the cargo submarine. Maybe one of you could talk about that, because when you're talking about a book, a wonderful book about fabric, you don't think about submarines. So maybe one of you could talk about that for a second.
There's a wonderful, one of the things that really tickles both of us about this whole project is, and I will get to the submarine, I swear, is the international outreach of wool families. It's like octopus tentacles reaching around the world. And so there's a family in Australia who are German, the Lohmans, and they are wool buyers and sell it back into Germany and other places in Europe. And so they arrive in the 1890s, I think. But in 1914, the head of the company goes back to Germany. I think he goes before the war starts, but anyway, he's in Germany, and he is intermarried with the people who run Hapag-Lloyd, which is the big German merchant marine company. And he works with someone to try and break the blockade. He works with someone and they develop 2 submarines that are capable of carrying cargo. They're not armed merchantmen, but one of them sinks during its first trial. I think it doesn't quite make it, but the other one makes 2 trips to the US from Germany, and it's called the Deutschland. And it brings cargoes of things like dyes and chemicals. Germany was the producer of the best dyes, and it had the best chemical producers. So things like all of the medical pharmaceuticals came from Germany. So the U.S. is really struggling for dyes and for the other kinds of pharmaceuticals and chemicals. So they load up this submarine and they bring that over. The Smithsonian has a relic of some indigo, a little pressed piece of indigo in a little presentation box saying it came from the Deutschland.
Where did the Deutschland land? Where did it come to in the U.S.?
I think that it came. The second voyage was to Connecticut, and I think the first voyage made. Trish, do you remember? I think it was either like Baltimore or Philadelphia, or Baltimore or New York.
It's certainly bringing dye to the US. Of course, it's the plan as well is to take back critical materials to Germany. I'm not sure that we know the details of those critical materials. What we do know is that Britain is afraid that still neutral US will send wool to Germany, so that when my grandfather in 1915 is trying to export Australian wool to the US, there's this really complicated set of documents that have to be signed with a red wax seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts saying, this is Australian wool just coming to the US, won't be further exported. There's all these tensions and fears about these strategic textiles during World War I.
Yeah, and
the Deutschland wasn't carrying wool. We know that.
Okay,
wasn't carrying that back.
But still, textile dye is really interesting.
It was carrying the dyes and the chemicals over, and but we think that they were carrying back certain. I wonder actually if they were carrying gunpowder back, because that was the things that DuPont sold to everybody. Mm-hmm. So. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that.
Well, the book is full of a lot of information about all kinds of spying and getting of sheep, as well as, in order to basically genetic material so that you can, as you were talking about, breed the sheep. I don't want to spoil any of those wonderful stories and of some of the families between all of the different aspects of the world. There's so much in the book, which is really exciting, and I really hope everybody wants to read it. But you also have a couple of other unique storylines I'd like to bring up, and I know Trisha might be best suited to talking about this because of this explosion of cold weather war. You have this need for all the sheep around the world that can produce textile fibers that are usable for clothing, because not all wool is really usable for clothing. And so much land is needed to sustain those 26 sheep per soldier that it has unintended consequences on populations. And maybe, Trish, you could speak about that, especially regarding the indigenous population of Australia.
So chapter 3 of our book is called Agents of Empire, and it uses Australia as the key case study, but there's different versions of it in other wool-producing nations. The wool industry and the huge growth of the wool industry in the late 19th century has terrible impacts on Aboriginal people in Australia because, yes, sheep need so much land. And, after the Napoleonic Wars, the British government lets, it's called the Australian Agricultural Company, but it's largely British citizens, can just choose 1 million acres of Australia where they want. And Britain, wants to get lots of sheep, lots of wool to bring back to Britain. There is no system of treaties in Australia, so that land is literally, Aboriginal sovereignty is completely denied. The same thing happens in Tasmania with the Van Diemen's Land Company. That's in Australian Agricultural Company's 1824. Van Diemen's Land Company is 1825. And again, it's people connected to the wool industry that are just given land in Australia. There's then the dominant model of land being taken up in Australia, however, and I use the word taken up is a euphemism, but is squatters, is people going out with their sheep, plonking the sheep on the land, working out how to protect those sheep. Eventually, Aboriginal people in Australia, as the Maori in New Zealand and the Rapa Nui in Easter Island, become a critical labour force for the wool industry. And our book follows Tup Bateman, is a wonderful woman aged in her 70s. Her 99-year-old mother was a shearer's cook. Tup was a wool classer. There's 8 generations of her family that have absolutely been vital to the wool industry. But that huge land grab of the 19th century is anything but pretty.
No.
Yeah. So unintended consequences. I don't know whether it was the British had trouble understanding the strength and complexity of Aboriginal societies in Australia, and they willfully ignored those connections, I think it is true to say.
Yeah, I was
Sadly.
just in
Similar thing.
I was going to say, I was just in Australia. I mean, I'm sorry, Australia. I was in Australia, but in Argentina last year, and went down to Patagonia, and of course, saw the gauchos and the sheep shearing and all of that, and witnessed firsthand from all of the driving around that area the vast amount of land that had been basically denuded by the sheep because they became very well off due to wool growth during World War One. That was the big source of Argentinian wealth.
And in that instance, in Patagonia, it's not colonialism pure and simple, like Patagonia is never a part of the British Empire in a formal sense, but it's British capital. So it's economic colonialism. Chile and Argentina don't have enough capital to really develop that land, and so it's British capital, and Rapa Nui becomes a midway point for the Scottish shipping company, Williamson Balfour, and Rapa Nui, Easter Island, also has a bit of its own sheep industry, as does Hawaii. So the 19th century, wool kind of spreads its tentacles across the world, especially to the Southern Hemisphere, nowhere more so than to Australia.
Well, I think in terms of indigenous people, I looked really hard for a sort of comprehensive account of how sheep affected indigenous, Americans, of North America. What happened as sheep followed colonists across the country. And I found bits and pieces of it in lots of different places, but I never really found anything that was a comprehensive account. And I think that that's lacking. And I hope someone puts that together because it's important. The stories that are told in a book called America's Sheep Trails, which is from the 40s and done from, the colonist perspective, really, are pretty horrific but fragmented.
Right. Well, to wrap up here, before we wrap up, I know we wanted to talk a little bit about modern fabrics, synthetic substitutes, and I have a particular background in that, and I know that we might end up flipping the conversation a little bit here. But can you tell us a little bit about the synthetic revolution and where that came from?
It all starts with rayon. Well, it starts there. The rayon's a 19th century invention. It basically regenerated cellulose fiber, and it is used in Germany during the First World War when they're looking for every possible thing they can use to eke out the supplies that they have of natural fibers. And so essentially, like the waste and short, they're using their artificial silk, which at that point is shiny as all get out.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
They're using that cut up and in a yarn mix, right, with other fibers. Very, very limited quantities because they weren't making very much. But by about 1920, in the early 1920s, DuPont starts making rayon in the US. There's several other companies that are very big, again, very integrated with the chemical production around the world. It's a different kind of internationalism. It's not the same kind of family stories that we found in the wool business. It's more a corporate story, corporate families, I guess. But they're trying to make rayon work, and so the first thing they do is deluster it so it's not so shiny, and then they chop it up and make it so it's a little bit more like cotton, and then they figure out how to give it a little bit of a twist so it's a little bit more like wool, and they call it staple rayon. It's often just called staple, and they try to incorporate this into woolen fabrics and cotton fabrics as well, to cheapen them, make them less expensive, but also to eke out the supplies.
Stretch it.
And population is growing, and that's something I think that's important to understand, is that the population of the world grows hugely over the 20th century. And the sheep population doesn't. So even though the amount of wool that's being grown is the same, relatively, the amount of wool that's being consumed by each person goes down because there are more people. So that's part of the problem today, is that there are too many of us to try and go back to only using natural fibers.
Well, that's an interesting point. That's a really interesting point you're making, which is we've outstripped the natural resources for fabrics, essentially, in the world. Yeah.
The other side of that equation is that we humans have got used to having more and more textiles around us, and rayon is one of the transitional points in that. Rayon can be produced more cheaply, more easily than wool or cotton. It creates horrible chemical
pollution
along the way, taking that cellulose, turning it into a chemical soup and then extruding it is not pretty, but it's cheaper. And I think it's our rayon chapter, isn't it? Is called Mary Has Two Dresses. And, if you now look at what we know about global textiles, I think that Australia and the US are the two countries that have the not proud history of using more textiles than any other and throwing away. I think the average Australian might buy 27 kilograms. These figures might be ropey, and throw out about 23 kilograms. The semi-synthetics like rayon, followed by full synthetics like first nylon in 1939, then acrylic and polyester, both of which get developed in the Second World War, create a kind of an expectation and a market for ever cheaper clothing. And so, yes, I think wool, the actual amount of wool used in the world, grows till about 1970, but as a percentage of all the global textiles, it's on a steady decline throughout the 20th century. So yes, it's about more people, but it's also about what those people expect and come to believe that they need and want.
Yeah, so I think it was interesting to see that your book went from being a story about natural resources, strategic materials, and war, and the properties of wool and why it is so desired, to this environmental story near the end of the book, which I, wholeheartedly, suggest people to read. I think that people don't necessarily understand how these big picture things such as supply chain or just the raw number of sheep per acre you can have, how it impacts our lives. And you guys did a really great job of putting that into words.
I think the thing that excited us both really was just the number of connections that we were able that we found as we read more and more and more and researched more and dove down any number of rabbit holes, which we're still finding.
Rabbit holes are the way to say it. And I think you and I, Madelyn, we met up at a lunch, going to a museum, looking at samplers together. And I started asking you about what you were doing, and you started telling me about the book you were writing. And I got very excited because you mentioned Polartec.
Exactly. And we want to hear about that from you.
Well, for those...
Because the invention of Polartec is what killed wool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, well, tell us about that part, and then I'll tell my story. What?
Well, all of a sudden you could keep warm without wool.
Right. So
for kind of thing. So, Trish, it's like, what happened?
Well, I came into the Polartec story late in its life. It had been around for many years. And of course, some people are aware of the story of Aaron Feuerstein and the fire at Malden Mills, which occurred. Malden Mills is actually not that far from me where I am. And I was an engineer at the time working on high-tech fibers at a local engineering company. And they had the fire, and they rebuilt, and he paid all of his employees, which was really amazing because, our textile industry in Massachusetts had been going down, down, down. And it was a very easy thing to just walk away, take the insurance money, and leave all of those employees without a job. And he was an incredibly impressive man. But, still, there were all these forces in the world were putting pressure on companies manufacturing in the United States. And Aaron was starting to look for possibilities to turn his Polartec fleece product, which is only one of the many products that Malden Mills had, which was a polyester that had been made into something you'd call like a terry cloth looking structure that was then run through wire brushes and broken up such that it became these little spirally polyester yarns, which looks like wool. And so it was masterful what they did in all kinds of different structures and treatments to get it to wick moisture away from the body and then also encapsulate air in the textile, which would then warm you by capturing your own body heat. But Aaron wanted more out of it, and so he came up with the concept of making it a heated blanket. Are either of you aware of that? The heated blanket? No. Okay. Well, I should have brought it down. Maybe I'll show a couple pictures on the screen of this. The heated blankets today are what's called a serial circuit, which means whatever the voltage coming out of your wall is what drives one big resistor to heat it up. And if you have any little break in it, it causes a fire in your blanket. You're all probably aware of that. Well, there's another way of electrically heating, which is called a parallel circuit, which breaks up the resistors into many different resistors that are fed by a much lower voltage. And that's a much safer way to heat something up. And so Aaron came up with a way, his engineers came up with a way to knit in stainless steel into the polar fleece. So imagine this, a knit piece of fabric, which is mostly polyester. You've got stainless steel going through every once in a while, all right? And then you take it and you fleece it. But there was 2 strip areas on either side that weren't fleeced. And there was ripe for something to connect to it in order to heat it up by plugging it into the wall, making an electric blanket. But there's no wires in it. Okay, so it's super soft and squishy and nice and cozy. And I had been developing a field called electronic textiles, and Aaron came to my company and asked me to develop the lines as textiles that would allow us to feed the stainless steel with electricity through it and heat it up. And we did. And it was the biggest selling product in Land's End. Sold tens of thousands. And it's still to this day the highest selling electronic textile product. And I have several upstairs. They are just super cozy and all nice, and people absolutely loved them. And this was a whole kind of product area he wanted to go off into. I ended up working for Polartec on site for about 2 years, helping them develop a woman's heated jacket system. Women are often cold. And so we developed this fabric heated system out of fleece that a woman could wear, and there are many, spin outs, but that really just didn't go fast enough, to be honest, to really keep Malden Mills as it was, and the company had to make changes over the years since then. But being inside the company and seeing all of the wonderful things that they did and developed was amazing, including all of the recycling of the polyester, because they did try to recycle quite a lot of these, plastic bottles into the yarns, talking about this environmental disaster of synthetic fibers. But that's kind of my Polartec history there.
Very
something
cool.
You didn't know, right?
No, I did not know. That's great.
I'll have to show it to you sometime when we get together. The Polartec fleece.
And I'm imagining these blankets don't often need or get washing, because it's the washing of polyester fibers that creates the microplastic pollution that is a current problem bedeviling the world.
Yes.
Having said that, of course, washing wool going way back created some pretty disgusting creeks and rivers as well. Again, all textiles carry a kind of a freight with them. We have to somehow use as few of them as possible and the best quality possible, and care for them and keep them and repair them. That's as far as Madelyn and I have been able to get to trying to answer the vexed problem.
Yeah.
Is use less, but wear it longer.
But I beg your pardon. Sorry, Madelyn, start again. I'm shutting up.
Oh, I said this is our call to action for viewers, is to use less, take care of it, wear it longer, and learn to repair, make and mend, redo, reuse, and buy the best you can afford, and don't worry about fashion, worry about style.
Well, gosh, guys, it has been really wonderful to talk to you about the book. I recommend all of my my watchers to read the book, because I think it's fascinating. And when you think about today and all of the things impacting the needlework industry, it's supply chain, it's where war is occurring. Our linen fibers come from Ukraine. And so all of these world events actually do impact what we use for craft and for our own clothing. And understanding that is a really lovely thing. So thank you guys very much.
Thanks very much for having us. It was really fun. And
thank you, Trish.